But this further, we're joined by Professor Swaran Singh, foreign affairs expert. He teaches at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Good evening to you, Professor. What do you make of what's been happening? This is not the first incident. This is probably not the last. And China is not just confronting Philippines in this manner in that region, both in the East and the South China Sea. It's been ramping up its run-ins with its neighbors.
Absolutely. What is happening in South China Sea, as China is doing around much of its periphery, is the increasing intensity and increasing frequency of such dangerous collusions on high seas. It does not care for international law anymore. 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration judgment it had neglected and defied. China is also incidentally signatory of something called Convention on International Regulations for Prevention of Collusions on Seas. But obviously, we have seen, as your report said, with almost all its neighbors around South China Sea, whether it is Japan, Vietnam, and Philippines, much more often, starting from October last year to April this year, in last 2 weeks, three times. There have been such adventurous gestures, including collusions, which I think is a matter of great concern for shipping is increasing around the world, and safety of sea lanes is very significant. And what China has done over a period of time is that it has turned in small reefs and shoals into artificial islands, and that is how it keeps extending its claim for what is United Nations Convention on Law of Sea says 200 nautical miles EEZ, which is exclusive economic zone. Now the territory, the shoal that is we are discussing today, is about 630 miles from China's coast, which is much closer,
About
120
1,200
miles.
kilometers.
So it's that is which is difficult to understand because it keeps extending its control on parasols and spratlets, and because it has control on mischief reef, it also now seeks to control much of the other smaller shoals and reefs which are relatively close to Philippines. So I think because in last 10 to 15 years it has been able to constantly uncontested continue to expand its control on various features in South China Sea and expand its claim to almost entire South China Sea, has resulted in its more adventurous gestures, particularly against Philippines in that sense.
Yes.
And there has to be some response to international law and conventions that China is part of. And I think international community, UN and other bodies must intervene and ensure that China follows international norms.
China has already rejected the verdict on the South China Sea in the past. But help me understand, because the US has called this move dangerous and escalatory. And it's one thing if China's Coast Guard or other vessels bully or try to assert their territorial rights on merchant ships. But this was a Filipino Coast Guard vessel, one of their largest Coast Guard vessels.
Indeed, I think what is interesting also to understand is what is called grey operations of China, in which case there is a whole lot of categories of ships that work for the Chinese Communist Party. Other than its Coast Guard and Navy, it also has militias. It has very often these so-called fishing vessels. In fact, many of these reefs see these fishing vessels infesting that whole region. And whether they are kind of part of Navy or Coast Guard or they are individual fishermen is very difficult to understand very often. And that is how a lot of gray areas continue to be there, which builds anxiety and tensions over a period of time. In that shoal that we are discussing, there is it's actually east of second Thomas Shoal, which Philippines had actually kept control for a long period of time with a rusted World War II small ship anchored there forever for a permanent presence, which was removed in April this year after some understanding with China. And Chinese have also allowed that they will allow refurbishing, replenishing of personnel, of storage of food, and so on. And then suddenly this now pushing them out of this Sabina shoal, saying that you should leave this and you should not have any presence here,
Yes.
is very unusual, unpredictable behavior. So
Hmm.
the various instrumentalities that Chinese are using are very grey and therefore difficult to
There
identify.
is one line of thinking, Professor, saying that China is basically trying to whittle down resistance of countries like Philippines, uh, which are militarily less mighty than China. China has built up its own military strength, especially maritime strength, in recent years. It's doing the same with Japan. It's doing the same with Taiwan. Perhaps Brunei as well, where Prime Minister Modi will also be going in a couple of days from now. But is it having the kind of effect that China thinks it will have, that these countries will back off, or is the reverse happening? Because all of them are friends with the US.
Absolutely. In fact, in 2014, Philippines had signed a 10-year defense pact with United States, and United States, of course, has made some comments. Also, India's foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, was there in March in Manila and had reiterated India's support to Philippine sovereignty, being important. Now, what is interesting is I can understand Japan and then, some other countries like India, maybe just not in any collective. But four of these countries, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam, they are part of ASEAN. ASEAN, for some reason, has never been able to collectively stand against China. And therefore, China takes advantage of dealing with these issues at bilateral level and keeps browbeating any of these countries. And we have seen, when the court of arbitration had decided something that Chinese have no claim on this region, the president, meanwhile, had changed in Manila, and the next president, Rodrigo Duterte, said that I don't care about this judgment. I want to have investment from Beijing. So, because they're able to incentivize and engage at bilateral level, I think that has also emboldened Chinese, because compared to any of these individual countries, China is much stronger, definitely. And because incrementally it has built its presence, I mean, they have surface to air missiles deployed in paracels in Woody Islands, for example, for several years now. And that kind of militarization of South China Sea, which has a great, traffic of ships, both civilian and military. In fact, more than $3 to $4 trillion of trade crosses through these sea lanes of communication here. And that is a concern for not just these countries that are kind of target of Chinese assertions and force projections, but for the entire region in that sense. So I don't understand why ASEAN should not be the first to combine, and ASEAN should bring other stakeholders like Japan, Russia, India into it, and create a collective kind of pressure on China to at least follow the conventions that it is signatory to. And therefore, I think it's very dangerous to start this new trend of collusion. And this, as I started saying, China's this whole style of collusion has seen much more frequency and intensity over years, and that I think is very dangerous. And sometimes things could really go out of hand in that sense.
Well,
So I
let's see if ASEAN learns a lesson from Australia's example. As long as it kept on giving in to China's wishes and bullying, it was bullied further. But now Australia has sort of taken a different stance with so many measures that have been undertaken in recent years, including AUKUS. So we'll have to wait and see if something of that sort takes place where ASEAN is concerned. But for the moment, thank you for joining us, Professor Swaran Singh.